So last week I went to an amazing conference and its main rationale was to connect widening participation policy and practice and research together. It was run by three individuals. There was Chris Bayes from the University of Lancaster, there was Gino Graziano from the University of Sussex and Louise Gaisley, who was also from the University of Sussex. Now I interviewed those three on the day and I was hoping to include what they said here, but it was ridiculously warm and my camera went funny, so unfortunately you just stuck with me. And sorry especially to Chris and Gino, who spent some time out to make the video. Anyway, the conference itself, what it did essentially was framed widening participation work as a kind of triangle. So on one point you had higher education policy, widening participation policy. On the other point you had widening participation research, and on the other end you had widening participation practice. What this conference aimed to do was bring those three together. Quite a lot of the time, and historically certainly within widening participation practice, there's been a strong sense of disconnection between the work that we conduct and deliver as practitioners and the research and the academic endeavour that goes into exploring the issues and finding out what works best. This for me has been incredibly frustrating because it just seems sensible, right? If you are working to widen access to HE, to improve the equity of access to universities or level 4 qualifications around the country, why wouldn't you make sure what you were doing was informed by robust evidence? But it isn't necessarily all of the time, and this conference was a way towards addressing some of that. There was one session in particular which I absolutely loved. It was run by Dr. Neil Harrison, who's now with the University of Oxford, and what he did was presented 5 key questions that widening access practitioners, those involved in research policy, should be asking if we want to develop the work that we do. What I'm going to do now is run through those 5 questions to give you a bit of an idea of what they are. I say this isn't my questions, this is Dr. Neil Harrison's questions. Hopefully a little bit later down the line I can get him on for a vlog, but at this stage you'll just have to make do with me describing some of the questions, but they're really valuable and useful, so stick with me. And I think the best ones kind of come towards the end, so 4 and 5 particularly are very good. So question 1, why won't raising aspiration die? Dr. Harrison argued it's been thoroughly discredited as a tool, as a concept. It's not something that's useful. It's got shades of victim blaming about it. Children probably don't share adult conceptions of aspiration. So if you ask a child what aspiration means, it's probably very different to what an adult would say about aspiration, and the way that you frame the idea of aspiration means that it's a bit woolly and it's difficult to get anything useful out of. And now we've got a range of alternative ways of viewing future career intentions, things like Dr. Harrison's possible selves model, horizons for action, and loads more besides. So why on earth are we using it? Why won't it just die? Why do we keep saying that communities lack aspiration and drive, and that's the reason for low participation in higher education? Because it's not true, and working any practice along those lines isn't going to be helpful to anyone. So that's question 1. Why won't aspiration raising die? And the second question, Dr. Harrison was asking, why is there so much dead weight in widening participation work? Now, dead weight sounds like a bit of a horrible phrase, and certainly if it was referring to students, it wouldn't necessarily be the most helpful phraseology. However, when Dr. Harrison was referring to dead weight, he was referring to practices that perhaps were used for targeting and engaging students in activity. Essentially, with this one, Dr. Harrison was suggesting that a lot of the work that we conduct as people that are supposed to be widening access to university may well be with people that are already going to go to university anyway. So is that really widening participation work? Are we actually targeting activity with learners who, unless they receive that activity or a combined part of a wider framework for progression, wouldn't just attend higher education anyway? And this throws up really interesting questions with regards to targeting or how we evaluate interventions too. Could it actually be argued that the interventions with the lowest success rates with learners might be the most valuable, because they're clearly individuals who might not have participated in higher education anyway? So although the numbers and the success is low, the impact that that work is having could be far greater. So that's question 2. Why is there so much dead weight in the outreach work that we do? Why are we conducting so much activity, perhaps, with individuals who are probably going to participate in higher education anyway? Now, question number 3 was, why is it that the Russell Group of universities, or perhaps you could argue higher tariff institutions more generally, are unable to widen their participation effectively. And that is something that personally I feel requires a lot of attention. Why is it that we've had this agenda for so long, but actual participation rates with regards to higher tariff or Russell Group institutions has hardly changed at all? Is it based on the individual and actually some form of deficit? Well, no, clearly the aspiration discourse has been debunked. So what are the structural mechanisms there that could be causing this? What needs to change through institutional practices to do better? Is it the case that we need to be working with these groups much earlier? Evidence suggests that yes, that is one thing that would possibly help. But also, how are we engaging with the communities in which these groups decide? What are we doing as institutions that could make more of an impact that we're having at the moment, especially with the higher tariff institution, because it's obviously not having the effect that we want it to? Question 4 was about whether young people in themselves were a reliable witness. And what do we mean by that? Well, I guess what it boils down to, and it was something that Dr. Harrison discussed in some detail, was how can young people effectively and accurately make meaningful statements about concepts or events that might happen in the future based on the experiences and the opportunities that they've had access to. How could we possibly ask a Year 9 child with any certainty whether they were going to participate in higher education if we have no idea on the levels of knowledge or understanding they have around higher education itself, or what it might take to participate in these future careers? And I guess this comes a little bit into the idea of aspiration versus expectation as well, which I've touched on in a video before. How do we know which cultural, social, economic tools these students are equipped with that are aligned to something that they might hold that aspiration towards? And if young people in that sense can't be reliable witnesses, then how do we shift our evaluative mechanisms? How do we look at different ways of looking at impact to address that and ensure that we are working as effectively as possible to develop our activity based on evidence that's going to make a significant impact? Because if we're getting our information off possibly unreliable witnesses, as it were, then we're also informing activity from the evidence from unreliable witnesses, which means there's no guarantee that that's going to do the job that we really want it to do. The final question, question 5, is why is it that young people from very, very similar background can end up on such different pathways when it comes to their trajectories in future education and work? Here, Dr. Harrison's making the case that actually we still know very, very little about how young people take decisions with regards to their transition into adult life. Why is it that some of these young people are able to transcend these difficulties and perhaps move on to elite institutions or become geographically mobile, whilst for others that doesn't seem to be possible, or it's certainly not something they've undertaken? Something that Dr. Harrison cites is the idea of relative risk, which is something he's been working on fairly recently. I'm not going to go into that now because it's a really interesting concept, but it would extend this by about 20 minutes. However, if you're interested in looking at some of Dr. Harrison's papers, I will drop some of the links to the Google Scholar pages in the description, so they're nice and easy for you to find. I certainly found the conversations that Dr. Harrison was having extremely interesting, and those questions that he posed are certainly ones that everybody, in my opinion, who works within widening participation and outreach practice for universities should be asking themselves. We all, as a sector, have a responsibility to grapple with these big questions, to examine where the evidence is coming from and what evidence we're using to inform the activity, and a personal and collective sense of responsibility to ensure that we are using all of the resources available to us to develop this activity as well. And within this Connecting Research to Practice conference, there was that triangle, that policy, research, practice triangle. We need to ensure as practitioners that we are connected to each of the corners of that triangle. Otherwise, what happens is we conduct activity based on speculation, assumption, thinking that we know tacitly rather than investigating whether what we think we know is accurate. And what that has perhaps been guilty of over the years is creating an environment in a lot of outreach activity where students are being placed in this deficit model, where we are doing something to students to make them socially mobile, to help them perhaps become middle class, because that middle classness or that social mobility is the gold standard. And on the flip side, it suggests that what they are at the moment, the person that they are, the communities that they're in, the social networks that they have, are somehow less valuable and somehow less desirable than this gold standard that we're asking these students to aim for. And that's not a healthy position to come from. And it's one of the underlying reasons that it's so important that we as practitioners ask ourselves, how can we best equip the students with the resources that they're going to need, that are going to allow them to achieve future happiness, contentment, security, and well-being? Because as widening access practitioners, as people that work in outreach, that have an interest in social justice, have an interest in more equity of access to opportunity, that's where we can have most impact. And if we use the right models, strengths-based models rather than deficit models, then we have a real opportunity to achieve that. But we need to know about them. If we don't know about them, we can't use them. If we're not engaged in conversations with policymakers, with researchers, and we're in the same room sharing the same space, then that's not going to happen. So we need to take personal responsibility for that as people that are involved in practice, and start engaging way more in academic research and in policy discussions to ensure that we're doing the best thing possible by the students. Right, I'll leave that one there for this week. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time.